Hello, I'm David Marler from Rotterdam University, and today, in this mini lecture, we're going to talk about historical criticism. Today, we're going to discuss what historical criticism is, what questions should we ask when we're analyzing texts. We're going to talk about when historical criticism is important, and finally, we're going to talk about how we can analyze literature according to historical criticism. Historical criticism is often called historicism. And when you're looking online, this is a term that you will often use and often come across when you're looking and researching the topic. Now, historicism or historical criticism was originally used when early academics were discussing the Bible. These early academics we also often call theologians, or people who studied theology or religion. Now, originally, when they were researching the Bible, historical criticism was a way to look at the importance that the time played when the text was written. And it also helped early religious study academics or theologians to understand the context of the Bible. And that's the most important part when using historical criticism, is it's looking for context. Now, one of these original stories that we can look at, an example in the Bible, is the wedding at Cana, which is better known in many Christian religions as the story of when Jesus turned water into wine. Now, today, we would see this as being a very strange miracle, but it's actually one of the few miracles that's described in the Bible. So early theologians and academics wanted to know why. Why was water turned into wine? And what was the importance of that in the society at the time? And they used this study of early society and early text and context from that time to try to better understand why it was important that water was turned into wine. And this is the birth of what we would call historical criticism. Now, in the late 1800s, when literary criticism and literature studies became more important, and definitely in the early 1900s, historical criticism was an important way to understand text and also kind of using the text as pieces of evidence to get a better look at society, because art often mirrors what's important in society. So one of the first texts that they, of course, used was one of the oldest texts in the Western canon, and this was called the Iliad and the Odyssey, written by Homer. Now, early people using historical criticism wanted to know more about the Greeks and this text. They wanted to know how they lived. What did they find important, and how could you see this in the text? What hierarchies did they have? What did their society look like? Who was the author, and what aspects of his life made it into the text? And what kinds of language can you find that's stereotypical for the text at this time period? And by studying texts, we learn a lot about the societies that the texts were written in. For instance, we learn a lot about the Greeks and what they found important, their ideas about death, their ideas about religion, their ideas about gods and the role that they play in society. We also see, for instance, evidence about their hierarchies, even about their sex lives. Achilles in the Iliad was known to have a relationship with another male, Patroclus. We also see by examining the language, for instance, that Homer wasn't one person, and this was actually a very striking revelation for academics at the time. They can look at the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they can see that the language was not similar enough, so it was impossible that it would have been written in the same time period. And so this leads us to what we use historical criticism or historicism for today. And it leaves us with questions. And when you start reading your texts and when you analyze texts using historical criticism, there are several questions that we have to ask ourselves. For instance, what was the period that the text was written in? And what is important from that period? We then have to ask ourselves how the period affected the text. How did people at the time interpret the text? Was the text important? Who was the author of the text? And how did his or her life affect it? And what does the text say about the zeitgeist? Now, zeitgeist is a difficult term, but zeitgeist essentially means the period and the way that people think at the time. So if people were to look at today's time period and study our music and our literature and our film and our television, they would get a general idea that there's this common thread, things that we find important or popular. And what does the text say about society? What does it say about our morals? What does it say about our lives in general? Now, example of this is in one of the books that we're going to read is the character Magwitch in Great Expectations, written by Charles Dickens. Now, this is going to be a spoiler alert if you haven't finished the novel, but Magwitch is actually the benefactor throughout the entire story, and we only hear about it at the very end. So in that way, Magwitch is quite an interesting character. We see him at the very beginning as the scary criminal who threatens Pip, that he comes across in the field, in the cemetery. And we also see him at the end when Pip has turned into a gentleman, and Magwitch comes back and says that he was his benefactor the entire time. But this leads us to some questions about Victorian society. For instance, he was the hero of the story, but he was a criminal, and he was an escaped convict. If we dig deeper, then we can actually find out that Dickens' father was in debtor's jail. And a debtor's jail at the time was that if you didn't pay your debts or if you went bankrupt, you were placed in a jail with your entire family. And especially in Victorian England, in 18th century England, this was a very, very shameful thing. And it really left a scar on society. How can we read this character as a form of social commentary on Dickens' part? The hero at the end of the book was the criminal at the very beginning. It was someone who was in jail. So what is this saying about Dickens's ideas on society and about criminals? Are they able to become better people, or are they forever trapped in their criminal ways? And what effect did this book have on society? We see, for instance, that there's a change with regards to the poor through the Victorian era, and this change actually eventually leads to the modern welfare state. It also leads to many 18th century and 19th century ideas, for instance, Marxism, the works of Marx and Engels that came out at around the same time. So what does this say about Victorian society? What does it also say that Magwitch is an anonymous donor, and at the same time a very wealthy Miss Havisham is taking credit for being the benefactor? This all says a lot about Dickens and his regards to the poor, and this would be considered a historical or a historic critical analysis of the book Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. So these are some of the questions that you are going to want to ask when you're analyzing the novels, and this is also something that you want to keep in consideration, keep in your thoughts when studying for the test. This is the end of this mini lecture, and thank you for listening.